You're watching A Closer Look. Professor Martin Davies, a visiting professor to the University of Papua New Guinea, highlights the challenges PNG faces as a resource-rich nation trying to sustain its resources and economy as a small developing country in the world.
The economy of Papua New Guinea has three sectors that operate and generate the revenue for the country. According to reports provided by a visiting professor to the University of Papua New Guinea, Professor Martin Davies, who presented the reports in a seminar hosted by the PNG National Research Institute, he highlighted the three sectors as, number one, the booming export sector, which includes the extractive sector like the liquefied natural gas. Number two, the lagging or traditional export sector like agriculture, and the non-traded goods sector. However, some sectors of the economy can be affected if concentration is given to only one sector and the others are not given much attention. According to Professor Davies, bigger extractive exports turn to suppress the traditional sector, putting more burden on locals who depend mostly on the traditional sector. This is seen through the locals suffering from rise in prices of goods and services.
Bigger extractives exports tend to contract our traditional export sector, so we get a concentration of our exports in extractives, which means we become much more sensitive to changes in those prices. If we had a very diversified export sector, commodities prices are always moving up and down, right? But if we tend to focus just in one area, extractives, we become very susceptible to movements in those prices. So that's one source of problems with the Dutch disease.
Some of the main challenges of a resource-rich country like PNG are when the country relies more heavily on revenues from commodity exports. This is called a Dutch disease.
We increase the demand for our currency, right? So we make the kina stronger. This is a very simple way of thinking about it. We make the kina stronger. It appreciates the real exchange rate, and it means that the goods that we produce in the non-resource sector, coffee, copra, palm oil, all of these things, become less competitive. So they are not as competitive on world markets because we've pushed our exchange rate up.
Another will be the enclave effects. This is seen in PNG, where a very few Papua New Guineans are working in the mining sector, which sees only few interaction with the non-mineral sector.
This is the idea that the resource sector, or these resource projects, in themselves are really enclaves. They have very few linkages with the non-resource sector. They employ a very small number of Papua New Guineans. They don't buy much from the rest of the economy. They don't interact with the non-resource sector in terms of buying goods or services or inputs. And Papua New Guinea doesn't really buy many of the outputs of the resource sector.
One other challenge is mainly on the government system and how it regulates different sectors in the country. With all these issues and challenges highlighted, Professor Davies said there is a solution to these economic problems for a country like PNG. The establishment of a sovereign wealth fund can really help stabilize the economy.
When you get these windfalls, these resource windfalls, these large increases in revenue or large increases in resource exports, which brings in foreign exchange, what you should do is save them in a sovereign wealth fund offshore. So you break that channel. You don't actually bring the revenues in, you save them, and then you have this ability to create also some intergenerational equity. So there's a sort of a two benefits in that policy. So that's one way to overcome the Dutch disease.
The Sovereign Wealth Fund was gazetted in Parliament around 2010 and 2011, and the second one was around 2014 when the country started exporting the liquefied natural gas. However, it was noted that no savings have been put forward to the fund. Prime Minister James Marape has recently announced in 2021 and late last year that 7% of state-owned enterprises' dividends will be put forward toward the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which Kumul Consolidated Holdings, when presenting its dividend to the government in November of last year, pledged some funds to the SWF. The Mara Peroso government has now tasked the agriculture, fisheries and forestry sector to bring in revenue to the country and contribute to the economy. Now, this non-mineral sector has almost 80% of Papua New Guineans engaged in compared to the mineral sector. According to Professor Davis, the potential of these non-mineral sectors can be suppressed if governments are focused on the mineral sector.
Booms. However they come about. One source of a boom might be that we start to produce LNG. Previously we weren't producing anything. LNG comes online, we start to produce LNG. Suddenly there's a big boom in our output and we're selling a whole lot on world markets. Another is when prices of oil or gas, just as recently as happened with the war in Ukraine, pushes up oil prices, pushes up energy prices. That also is a source of a boom, right? Now this causes an appreciation of the exchange rate and it hurts our traditional export sector. So it lowers the output of our export sector.
If the government is focusing on the non-mineral sector to generate income for the economy, the government must now regulate the mineral sector, the foreign reserves that comes into the country, so there is no liquidation in the economy that can lead to inflation and limiting the non-mineral sector's potential to trade in markets. If the mineral sector is not regulated, this can cause macro instability. Macro instability comes about when there is instability in the real exchange rates. With macro instability, it can chase away investors.
So you have to have your own insurance policy. You have to, in a sense, save for those rainy days, if you like. That's the idea. So when prices crash or when a project like Porgera goes offline and you have a big fall in revenues, you have a stabilisation fund. You've saved for those rainy days.
Another problem which can come about from the macro instability is the instability of the foreign reserves. The recent hiccup in the fuel shortage is basically around the foreign reserve shortage. How does this come about? According to Professor Davis, this comes about due to the government not being able to take more natural resource rents from mining projects in the country. It is estimated that PNG gets a minimum of 20% from rents, which is still very low compared to other resource-rich nations. It shows the inability of the government to bargain in signing up deals and policies.
So one of the things that we found is that the government take, when it moves around, it requires adjustments in the real exchange rate, which means you have to adjust the kina. Now, we could argue that the current foreign exchange shortages are a result of that instability in government take, and I'll show you in a little bit in a moment. We see government take in PNG has declined sort of monotonically, decreasing since about 2010, 2009, 2010. There's been a significant decline, which requires a decrease in the real exchange rate, a depreciation of the real exchange rate. Now, that's been resisted, and as a result, that's why we've had these foreign exchange shortages.
In any major project, there is 4 phases to it. These 4 phases can create instability in the economy. These are the investments, production, revenue, and the ending state. This will cause economic boom as well as depression. This calls for the government to make good policies and introduce the culture of savings to save when the economy is booming, to cater when the economy is at its lowest.
Countries like Papua New Guinea and small countries, countries with smaller economies, the resource projects tend to be very large relative to the size of the economy. And this is a sort of increased, I think that there's also a trend amongst the resource sector that projects are getting larger. So when you have a project that's very large relative to the size of your economy, as it moves through its production phases, the various production phases, the movement between those phases can also be a source of instability. So if we think about, if we put PNG LNG into the United States, the largest economy in the world, that project, although it's very large, would have no macroeconomic impact on the United States because it's such a big country. You put that project into Papua New Guinea, it has a large impact. It's a large share of the economy.
In conclusion, the government must create good policies to govern and run the mineral sector and non-mineral sector, creating employment opportunities for the citizens. If the government is concerned about the 80% of the population who entirely depends on the non-mineral sector, it must focus on regulating the mineral sector in the country. Professor Davis said the important thing the government should do is to tap into the savings culture.
And that's all we have for you this week. Join us next Sunday for another episode of A Closer Look. From all of us here, pleasant viewing. Good night.